Whatever your job is, I doubt it's as stressful and worrying as having to get into a cage and fight for your life to make a living. Maybe not. Maybe you're a deep-sea crab fisherman or something, but pretty much every fighter has admitted they have nerves and anxiety before they make that walk to the cage.
I always was terrified before every fight, and I don't like that feeling.
And you can imagine, the scarier the opponent, the more nervous and worried you're going to get. But there's some fighters who have gone one step further, especially when coming face to face with some of the most dominant champions in MMA history. And some of those fighters have even admitted that they just knew before the fight had even got started that they were already going to lose. I'm Balian from MMA On Point. Shout out to all the channel members and Hall of Famers. Thank you very much, guys. And these are 10 title fights where not even the challenger thought they had a chance. Number 10, Dan Hardy versus Georges St. Pierre. Lifelong martial artist Dan Hardy took the hard road to get to the octagon. It's all well and good now if you go 5-6-0 and get a shot on the Contender Series, but Dan had 25 fights in just 4 years before he got a call to come to the UFC. And when he got there, he was massively promoted by the UFC as part of their UK expansion, and he flew up the rankings, winning 4 in a row. Now that was back in 2010 when GSP was the undisputed king of the welterweights. He'd already racked up a bunch of defences, the UK was popping, and so Dan Hardy got himself a title shot. But he was under no delusions about how tough of a task it would be to beat GSP, especially having already spent time training with him.
I went to train with GSP a few times and helped him out, and he spent $250,000 on his training camp, right? I was making $22,000. How could I compete? I had a good brown belt in my corner, and I had a Thai boxing coach that didn't realize I couldn't knee on the floor. But I've sparred with him kickboxing. He's a great striker as well. Yeah. You know, he could have given me nightmares on the feet as well. I wish he'd given me the chance.
Hardy still went in there and put on a resilient performance, and did say, if he stands with me, I believe I could hurt him. But obviously, there was no way he was going to make GSP just do that for him. In fact, George didn't even let Dan spend 60 seconds on the feet. And Dan even admitted, you know, if somehow he had managed to win, it would have kind of been pointless as well.
If I'd have beaten him, I would have been treating like Matt Cierre beating him. And he would have beat me in the rematch because I wasn't as good a martial artist as he was.
Number 9, Tank Abbott versus Maurice Smith. Okay, everyone, I want you to do an exercise. Close your eyes, imagine it's 1995, and now picture in your mind what the most dangerous cage fighter on the planet looks like. Yes, I know, you're picturing a rotund human sledgehammer who's named after a war machine. Tank Abbott was the first guy to wear gloves in the UFC and the first person to KO someone stiff with a punch. Sorry, John Matua, but either way, Tank Abbott was the guy they put on Friends when they were talking about the UFC. He rode a motorbike, he had a leather jacket. He was one of the kind of first stars in the sport, really. The only problem was, well, he was way more of a brawler kind of guy, so when the sport started to evolve, well, he almost purposely just didn't. Either way, after 4 UFC events, he was 6-4 and somehow would always lose in the finale or just before he could win the event. Then they matched him up with Vitor Belfort and it was a complete blowout. And, you know, well, maybe, yeah, Tank Abbott was never going to be able to compete with the best. And it's probably because that man just loves to party.
You've got a fight in a few hours. You're standing there with
a couple beers never hurt anybody. You know, I'm not drinking the hard stuff right now. That's for after the fight.
Okay, so maybe that bar scene was a skit, but this actually happened when Tank randomly, on short notice, got a title shot against the heavyweight champ in 1997. Tank was on a 2-fight losing streak. Dan Severn injured his hand, and so on about a week's notice, Abbott agreed to fight the champ, a much bigger, more skilled, well-trained and prepared fighter that he knew he had zero chance of beating, because if that wasn't bad enough, he'd not been training at all.
What are you doing? Wrestling, boxing, drinking? Yeah.
Maurice Smith basically then slammed him with leg kicks for 8 minutes until a very out of shape and tired Tank said he'd had enough.
I haven't been training, I've been partying. Fuck it, I don't give a fuck about a beating.
Number 8, Tanya Evinger versus Chris Cyborg. While the women's divisions rolled on into the UFC, Tanya Evinger seemed pretty happy over in Invicta, snogging Laura Sanko and defending her championship belt. If you're doing well enough though, you know, you're more than likely going to get that phone call from the UFC. And after 10 years, Tanya had nearly given up. But the UFC's featherweight division had a minor malfunction, and not only did Tanya know it was coming, but she was pretty sure she knew who the opponent was going to be when the UFC picked up the phone. The featherweight champion, Germaine de Randamie, had refused to defend her featherweight belt against Chris Cyborg.
I think when you have a belt, you're supposed to fight the best there is. I think that she knew she wasn't going to win that fight or didn't have confidence she wasn't going to lose that fight.
And this also all came on just 1 month's notice and also up a weight class. The fight had apparently come up tons of times when they were both in Invicta, but Tanya had always turned it down because, well, they just weren't offering her enough money to step in there with a half-human, half-unstoppable AI robot. And she obviously admitted, yeah, she was stressed and worried about what was going to happen, but that's the same with every fight. All that talk of controlling her fears, though, didn't really translate into her performance, and ultimately her emotions got the better of her in the contest where she fought a very hesitant fight until she was finished in the 3rd round, and she admitted post-fight,
I just feel like I fought like a pussy. I don't know why I went down, I don't know why I didn't get up. I just expected more out of myself than anything.
She'd admitted she was scared going in there, but did it anyway, but unfortunately, it definitely contributed to the loss. Number 7, Diego Sanchez versus BJ Penn. When you're running a UFC reality TV show for the first time, you need people like Diego Sanchez, just anomalies who, yeah, absorb energy during thunderstorms, but also beat the fuck out of everyone and ends up being 17-0 by 2006 with 6 wins in the UFC. A positive Mary Jane test, though, after his fight with Joe Riggs, and after that fight, he would then lose in back-to-back defeats against the top new welterweights, Josh Koscheck and John Fitch, and after that, a reinvention was in order. Diego went on a 4-fight win streak, dropping down to lightweight and putting on a fight of the year against Clay Guida. Okay, I'm sure you've bloody seen that one. Now, that win made Diego an absolute superstar, and he was getting more money and attention than ever, but it also meant all his vices were about to be dialed up to 11.
After my Clay Guida fight, I went down a bad path, man. I got sucked real deep into the fame and the money and partying. I was smoking so much weed, it was ridiculous.
And of course, while all these problems were going on, he was given a title shot to take on the most dangerous and primed version of BJ Penn there's perhaps ever been, and he got absolutely massacred. And he knew the drinking and the sticky icky put him in a place he was not ready to fight the champ. After the loss, he continued to spiral, and it all got much worse. Diego said this about his next fight after the champ.
I was still drinking leading up to the Hathaway fight, you know what I mean? And I knew that I had no place even stepping in the cage, but I had to because I needed the money.
Ask yourself this, I mean, how could he possibly have been ready for BJ just a few months before if he wasn't ready for Hathaway? He said things got worse, yes, but even still, if you look at Diego's record, right before the BJ fight, he was putting on amazing performances, and right after the Hathaway fight, he managed to get sober, and he went right back again to winning multiple fights of the night in a row. The BJ fight shows in a massacre that was just as bad as the Hathaway fight. Diego knew he was not in the right place to compete against Penn. He just went in there unprepared, undisciplined, and he kind of got fucked up. Number 6, Josh Koscheck versus GSP 2. The curly-haired blonde wrestler Koscheck became probably the most famous in the UFC for being the guy fans would vote they most wanted to punch in the face. Okay, that's a bit harsh, but it's mostly because of season 1 of The Ultimate Fighter, where he knew he had to act out because it was reality TV. Jokes aside though, he was a standout wrestler in college, and that wrestling carried him to 9-1 in the UFC, right in line for a shot at GSP coming off the loss to Matt Hughes. Now, going into the first fight, Josh thought he had the superior wrestling. He banked everything on teaching this Canadian karate guy what the fuck was up with US collegiate wrestling. St. Pierre, though, controlled him for 9 of the 15 minutes, and Kos only landed 9% of his strikes. So, yeah, that wrestling game plan, that was not going to work when it was time for a rematch. Josh went back to the division, and 3 years later, he'd risen back to the #1 contender status, and he'd worked on his striking. I mean, he got a few knockouts on the way. The UFC put together a season of The Ultimate Fighter, and pretty much from the get-go, it seemed like the best strategy Josh had was to try and annoy, taunt, and get inside of George's head as much as possible. Well, it definitely didn't work. In fact, Josh kind of got distracted trying to harass that male nurse on GSP's team he kept going on about. That guy's still a UFC cut man, by the way. Most fans thought Kos was already cooked and clearly just freaking out. That's not exactly an admittance he was going to lose, though, but people also read into his fight week attitude.
This fight is just another fight, and I plan on showing up and taking it as just another fight.
Some fans said it was reality finally sinking in, and he was going to have to go to Canada to fight George, and he got perhaps one of the loudest boos ever when he walked out. But as soon as the fight started, Koscheck has admitted that he already knew it was over.
I broke an orbital bone plate in my eye, and on the first punch of the fight.
Josh knew his eye was completely fucked, and he wanted to just quit there and then, but after talking all that trash, he was determined to keep fighting as long as he could. So instead, he got his eye jabbed over and over again for 25 minutes.
I'm very gracious of the UFC for giving me the opportunity to do that and fight for the title.
Even post-fight, he admitted that all the talk and bravado was just him trying to get people interested, even if he doubted his own chances.
George St. Pierre is a true champion. I try to do what I can to hype the fight up.
It was a gutsy performance from Josh regardless, even if he suffered permanent damage.
Actually, I don't even shave with a razor anymore because even if I do that right there, I feel the numbness in my eye. So I think of George quite often.
Number 5, OSP versus Jon Jones. The Jon Jones joyride left the light heavyweight division in a state of turmoil like the fall of the Galactic Republic. But Daniel Cormier finally got his chance to hold on to 205 gold, and he was defending it. When Jon was ready to come back, obviously the UFC wanted to book him against Cormier, and well, they tried, but UFC 197 instead became an absolute nightmare. 197 was supposed to take place in Brazil in February, if you can believe it. It was set aside for Silva versus Vitor Belfort, but apparently the Phenom turned the fight down, so that event became UFC Fight Night Hendricks versus Thompson. Then they tried to take it to New York, but a federal judge denied the injunction to allow the event. We're kind of getting off topic here, but basically this event was super cursed. It was finally booked, and 20 days out, Dan injured his foot and had to pull out. Now the UFC went to Rumble Johnson, but he just had an operation, so the shot at Jon Jones went to number 6, Ovince St. Preux. Now, no offense to OSP, but he'd not beaten any UFC competition near the level of Jon Jones, so everyone was pretty certain this guy didn't have a chance. Short notice, super high level competition, and a guy who was probably coming back more hungry than ever because his rival was holding his belt. Either way, it was clearly an uphill battle, but truly, all hope for OSP went out the window when his arm was broken in just the second round.
And my arm is killing me right now. I did throw my left hand. 3rd, 4th, and 5th round.
You can tell OSP knew exactly what he was up against and just didn't give himself much of a chance to win. And it seemed like in that fight, Jones was too scared to lose and OSP was too scared to get seriously injured. Ultimately, Ovince told MMA Junkie it was an opportunity. Anyone would have been stupid not to take an opportunity. It was presented to me, I went ahead and took it. And I tried to make the best of that situation. Number 4, Raging Al versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. At first, on paper, UFC 223 was going to be amazing. Tony Ferguson and Khabib were going to fight for the title with Conor McGregor off on some side quest somewhere. But of course, if you know anything about that cursed pay-per-view, Tony tripped over a cable and fell out of the title fight, and McGregor attacked the fighter boss, and then the other half of the card fell apart. Max Holloway was willing to step up, but the New York Commission stopped him from cutting any more weight, so they went through all the lightweights that were booked at 223, and it was Al Iaquinta who had the opportunity of a lifetime to fight one of the scariest fighters ever on basically 1 day's notice.
I might have slept like 2 or 3 hours that night, and I was like, holy shit, this is wild. This is crazy.
Of course, Al Iaquinta, he was cool with the idea of fighting Khabib on 1 day's notice, right?
You'd have to pay me $2 million to fight, $1 million to fight Khabib. I don't want to fight that fucking guy. You see what happened to Barbosa? What, are you nuts?
Okay, I don't know if he got $2 million, but Al knew he was going up against one of the best grapplers ever and a scary individual. And he'd been training for Paul Felder, okay, a Muay Thai striker. What could he actually do in 1 day to prepare for it? And Al thinks he might have gone into the fight with the wrong mindset entirely.
It was less to lose, I think. I was kind of like a win-win situation, and maybe that was kind of like the wrong attitude to go in there with, but I'm just going to go in there with what I got, what I've trained with my whole life, and see how it plays out.
To be fair, he took Khabib 5 rounds, which no one would ever do again. But he knew that without a training camp focused at all on wrestling, I mean, the result was a foregone conclusion. Number 3, Derrick Lewis versus Daniel Cormier. I feel like I ask this question a lot, but are there actually people out there who dislike Derrick Lewis? I mean, as a fight fan, he's everything you want in heavyweight. He's also a comedian and a goddamn hero during moments of crisis. But one thing we don't want to see is Derrick Lewis fighting wrestlers, right? If you're going to sell me a fight with a knockout king of the UFC, don't make me watch him get sat on for 25 minutes. And he's been taken down and controlled by quite a few guys. But after you've won 9 out of your last 10 fights, and 7 of them were KOs, there often isn't many other people for you to fight but the champion, who was, in the time, 2018, Daniel Cormier, one of the best wrestlers ever. So this was a nightmare matchup, and it all happened because UFC 230 was also kind of cursed. It was again in New York, so it was supposed to be a big deal, but the flyweight championship fight that was meant to headline fell apart. Twice, basically. So on less than a month's notice, the UFC pleaded with Daniel Cormier to save the card, and in return they would throw him Derrick Lewis, who everyone thought well, this is going to be the easiest fight of DC's heavyweight career. Especially, guys, because just 3 days before the fight was announced, Derrick Lewis had just taken a 14-minute beating before he managed to flatline Volkov. You're good to go in a month, right, Derrick? Now, I wouldn't just believe that he was going to lose if Derrick wasn't basically indicating fight week that he felt pretty much the same way.
I don't care about the belt. I will try to win the belt, though, but I really don't care about it if I get it or not.
Now, okay, that might just be a defense mechanism, right? Pretend not to care just in case you do lose. But then he just kept on going.
No, I don't train like a mixed martial artist. I don't respect the sport like everyone else does. Still believe Stipe probably should have been next. It is what it is, but I'm happy, I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Mate, you don't sound like you're either of those things. And we all get it. You had to fill in on 1 month's notice against your worst style matchup. I think this just proves that Derrick Lewis will literally try and punch anyone if you pay him enough. Number 2, Chael Sonnen versus Jon Jones. Some fighters definitely talk a lot more trash than others, but not many have talked more shit before a fight than Chael P. Sonnen, who more often than not would back it up with his hard-nosed wrestling. Somehow though, in the latter half of his career, he talked himself into a fight up a weight class with the most dominant champion in the UFC, and he immediately knew it was probably a bad idea. He'd spent the last few years watching Jon Jones' career and was very impressed.
I just watched him and go, man, that guy's good.
Chael also got to do a whole season of The Ultimate Fighter against Jon, which was awesome, but probably also gave him multiple opportunities to realize how much fucking bigger Jon Jones was. And by the time of the conference call, Sonnen was ready to believe that Jon was gonna just walk through him.
He was talking about the things that he had to do to beat me, and he was talking about the things he had to do to be the best light heavyweight ever, who he was saying was Tito Ortiz. And I'm listening to this going, there's none of those things that are true. You're going to kill me, and you would kill Tito too.
By the time fight night came around, Chael knew his chances were pretty much zero.
There's been some times when I've left the locker room and known I was a lamb. I did not think I was going to beat Jon Jones the night that I fought Jon.
Of course, being the American gangster, he went out there and did it anyway. And heck, if it had gone longer than a round, he might even have won because Jon's toe snapped in half. But P. Sonnen, he was never not going to make that walk. All right, we got time for a couple of honourable mentions. When the inexperienced Megan Anderson had to face the greatest women's fighter ever, Amanda Nunes, most people thought she was just going to straight up lose anyway. And then everyone saw her face backstage when she arrived at the venue, looking like Casper the Ghost. And she also kind of admitted that, she didn't get enough training and she blamed James Krause for the whole thing. Donald Cerrone, when he fought Conor McGregor, he straight up admitted that he just wasn't ready for that fight, but that wasn't for a title. When he went up against Rafael dos Anjos in a rematch, he said, I need to start fast. He knew that, but he just didn't do it, And afterwards he said, maybe I should quit drinking, but I'm not. Quit partying, but I'm not. I live life to the fullest. I fucking drink beer and party, and that's what I do. And that's the reincarnation of Tank Abbott, folks. Number 1, George St. Pierre versus Matt Hughes. Now, George had kind of had the opposite career path to get to the UFC from Dan Hardy, who he started with. Granted, it was early in the MMA timeline, but in his second ever pro fight, George won a Canadian championship. And by 5-0, he was already in the UFC. But that actually is kind of why he's in this video, because his title shot just came way too soon. And I'm not surprised. You've got this young, incredible phenom in amazing shape looking like one of the most well-rounded martial artists ever. And then you've also got this other guy, Matt Hughes, who was the pound-for-pound #1 and most dominant champion in the world. Until, BJ Penn appeared like Nemesis from Resident Evil and just spoiled his party. Hughes was basically an idol to George St. Pierre, and that completely psyched him out before the fight even got started.
If you look at the stare downs, I could not even look at him in the eyes. I was looking up. I was like, man, it's impossible. I didn't even believe I could beat him.
Matt Hughes submitted GSP in the first round and then would go on to continue being the UFC's welterweight champ for another 2 years, until St. Pierre got a second shot and beat him in the rematch, learning from the first encounter.
It taught me something. I should never put nobody on a pedestal. He's a human being and I can beat him.
If it bleeds, we can kill it.
Big shout out to Max Randall. Thank you, Max, for editing this one. Show him some love on the social medias or his new YouTube channel, The Combat Arcade. Shout out to all of you Hall of Famers out there. Thanks, guys. We appreciate extra support you give us on the channel. If you want to join them, guys, there are some cool benefits. Click the button down below, find out more. If you want to see more from us as well, you can always click subscribe. You'll get notifications and you'll never miss a video, and we make a lot of them.